We have two ways that we can write eighth notes when we're notating music. The first way that we can write eighth notes is by writing individual note heads, stems, and flags. Let me show you what I mean. The basic or default way that we write an eighth note is like this. We actually start with something that looks like a quarter note. So suppose I want an eighth note on the bottom line of the staff here, on the first line of the staff. I'm going to make my note head, my filled in note head, just like I would when I was making a quarter note. I'm going to make a stem going up and to the right, and it's going to go one octave up into the middle of that E line. It's all exactly the same as I would do for a quarter note. But now I'm going to add, to make this look like an eighth note, and remember an eighth note is half of the length of a quarter note, or 1/2 of a beat. I'm going to add what is called a flag. A flag is this sort of curvy extension that comes off of the stem like that. And it curves out and then it curves back in like this. That is an eighth note flag, and it comes down, you'll notice, and almost nearly hits the note head again, but not quite. You'll see a lot of different varieties of ways to make eighth notes, but this, I think, is the best and the most consistent one. Let me do a couple of other ones here. Let me write one that's on the G line. Here we go. Here's an eighth note that's on the G line. Again, I'm going to start exactly as if this is a quarter note, going up an octave, and then I'm going to make that flag coming off of it like that. And again, notice that flag goes almost to the note head one more time. And notice, the flag always goes on the right side. The flag will never go on the left. The flag always goes on the right side of the note. And this is true even if the stem is going down. Let's do a down stem note. And remember, the third line is always our line that tells us whether the stem is going up or down. If it's below the third line, the stem goes up. If it's above the third line, the stem goes down. If it's on the third line, we have the option. We can go either up or down. So let's do a down stem one. Let's go on the E that's up here on the fourth space. So here's an E. I'm going to write that note head almost as if this is a quarter note, like this, but now I'm going to add the flag. And notice, even though the stem's going down, the flag is still on the right. The flag is always, always, always on the right. Let me do one above the staff way up here. Here's a C. And so our line is going to go all the way down to the third line, and the flag will go up like that. So that is the basic way that you write individual eighth notes. But there's another way that we can do eighth notes as well. We can actually do eighth notes in groups, and you may almost more commonly see eighth notes like this. And let me show you how they look individually flagged and then what we call beamed together. So suppose I have two eighth notes. Let me go down. Let me do an F and an A. So let me show you what these would look like if I flagged them individually. Here we go, like this, two individual eighth notes, and this is perfectly fine. There we go. I also, though, have the choice of beaming them together. Rather than writing a separate flag on each one of these eighth notes, I could also beam them together. And to beam them together, I go through the exact same steps. I'm going to make what looks like the beginning of a quarter note with those stems. But instead of adding the flag to each eighth note, I'm going to beam them together. I'm going to make a line that connects the top to the bottom, like that. Now, musically, what you see here on the left is exactly the same as what you see here on the right. You would perform these exactly the same way. There's no difference between the way that you perform these. Just aesthetically, sometimes it's easier to read, especially when you have a lot of eighth notes, if they're beamed like this, and it is definitely easier to write than having to write all of those individual flags. And if you write the stems correctly, if you do the stems, at least in small groups of eighth notes, exactly an octave, then the angle of the beam will work out perfectly. Do a C and an F here. Perfect. Perfect. I just attach the top of those stems to one another. Where it gets a little bit tricky is when you start to have large groups of eighth notes strung together. And here's where the rules start to get a little bit less precise. Suppose I have a group of 3 or 4 eighth notes. Let me do a group of 4 just to show you the idea. So notice each of these eighth notes, or what will be eighth notes, all have a different height. So if I were to try to attach them all with a beam, the beam would be kind of broken. So we sort of have to fudge it a little bit, and because we want to create, we see that the direction of these 4 notes generally goes up at this angle. So we want to sort of we want to arrange our stems so that the beam that we make roughly follows that angle, something like that. So it's a little bit, we have to use our judgment a little bit when we start getting into large groups of eighth notes. And as you start looking at music, pay attention to how are people beaming eighth notes together, and that will give you some idea of what a good way to do it is. One other thing I want you to know about eighth notes, though, is if you have a large group of eighth notes, and some of those eighth notes are above the third line and some of them are below, you sort of take an average. For instance, suppose I have, let me write 3 eighth notes here. So if I were beaming these notes individually, the A stem would go up because it's below the third line. The D stem would go down because it's above the third line, and the F stem would go down because it's above the third line. But notice you can't beam these 3 together. So what we do is if we're beaming together a group of notes that straddle the third line, where some notes are above and some notes are below, what we do is we sort of take an average and see, are there more notes above or more notes below? And if there are more notes above, the stems will go down. If there are more notes below, the stems will go up. So in this case, since we have 2 notes above the third line and 1 note below the third line, the notes above the third line are going to win. So everybody's stem is going to go down. If we had the opposite, though, suppose we had 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we have, we wanted to beam these all together, here we have 4 notes, 3 of which are below the third line and 1 of which is above. So the notes below the third line this time are going to be the winners. So everybody is going to have their stems going up. Just like that. There's some other complications you'll run into with eighth notes, but this should give you the basic idea of how to get started with them.